Hey everybody, it's Professor Snart checking in again as we actually already wrap up our Unit 1 assignment and now begin to look at Unit 2 for our English 1130 Intro to Lit class online here. Again, the 12-week session means we move a little bit more quickly than we might in the slightly longer 16-week session. So just something to get used to. So again, just kind of an overview. You'll always be landing here at the introduction or the announcements page. Watch these videos. I'll try to keep this one a little bit shorter than the first one. Again, that first one covered like a lot of territory, so a little bit longer. Almost always me just talking over our actual class. Here's the Unit 1 video that you should have watched already. So I'm recording this on Thursday morning, September 12th, and so your kind of go-to places will become the due dates and the units list here. Syllabus, again, really just good for the big overarching course policy type things. It's not our day-to-day schedule. So here we have our English 1130, our due dates, I should say. We started the term kind of awkwardly on that Tuesday, so that meant we had our first due date for main work being completed in Unit 1 by that Wednesday, and now it's Thursday here. I've actually corrected this date. It should be Thursday, September 12th. The Google Doc just hasn't updated yet, but it will soon. So Thursday, that's today, you're doing all the replies for Unit 1. Again, Unit 1, pretty straightforward as far as the work goes, not really a content-heavy unit. Keeping in mind that people are just sort of getting used to how the class is set up and, this new course that you have in your schedule now, so all that kind of stuff going on. And then we get into a more regular structure here where we have our Tuesday due date for all main work within a unit, and then that extended Thursday for any replies that are happening. And replies are happening in just about every unit in some form or another, usually through the Blackboard discussion board, just the basic reply feature in there, but sometimes we do a couple of different things. But anyway, so back to Unit 1 really quickly, just to make sure everyone's on the same page. Here we set up, or you set up your portfolio, or we call it e-portfolio, your website using the new Google Sites Builder. Make sure you use the new one, not the old one. There's a immediately obvious visual difference. Not to mention the ease with which the new builder works versus the old one. Again, getting that Google account, setting up your site, going through the various places to click and buttons to click here. Building your About Me page, your introduction page, a couple paragraphs about yourself and a picture. Really helps us, again, build that sense of sort of class community. So you publish your page, then make it officially on the web, although again, there are ways to make it basically not findable on the web if you're worried about that. That produces your site URL, and that's what you would have posted already to the Unit 1 discussion board here in Blackboard. So again, getting used to how we've kind of threaded together the Google tools for really doing the work of the class, and then the Blackboard side for just sort of collating that stuff, collecting it, and the convenience of it being now attached to you in the gradebook, so it's just like a grading efficiency thing as well. And then keeping in mind that per our due date structure, you also have this reply component, again, just using the discussion board reply feature. So you'll see this discussion board populated with a bunch of threads with people's website URLs. So you should be able to click those, visit the sites, just see what people have to say, and then use that reply tool. Again, develop a decent paragraph or two. This isn't just a, hey, I live in Wheaton as well, or whatever, really quick response, especially once we get into the content part of our course, but really even here as well. A really great reply shows evidence of you really engaging with whatever the thing we're replying to is, whether it's someone's About Me page, or maybe a story from our readings, or conceptual stuff from class, or really threading that stuff together once we get a little bit further into the class. So just doing a reply, or in this case 4 of them, so you're connecting with classmates, just doing the bare minimum doesn't mean you get full points for it. That should sort of go without saying, but that full point thing, or close to full points, is really, again, sort of going above and beyond, or really developing a reply that ultimately shows me evidence of what we call time on task, that you actually spent some time doing it. And like it or not, Blackboard does timestamp everything that you do, and I don't look at that consciously, but it's hard to not to notice if you are always the person who is posting at like 11:58 p.m. of the due date day, so right up against the wire. If you've done 4 replies and they're all within like a minute of each other, that just doesn't show me a lot of evidence of spending time in the class, on the class. And again, as far as that time on task thing, I'll just remind that were you in the physical classroom for this class, taking it face to face, even in the 16-week format, you'd be in the classroom for 3 hours, 3 50-minute hours, every week. And that's just classroom. Forget about homework or extra stuff that you might be doing. And so that's even more in the 12-week term. So when I'm seeing like 4 or 5 minutes investment in 4 replies to classmates, that's not like super impressive. And like I said, I don't actively really seek out that Blackboard information, but it's right there in front of me as part of the like grading interface. So it's hard not to notice sometimes. So anyway, that kind of wraps up Unit 1, really just getting settled into the class, getting your portfolio set up since we'll be using it pretty much throughout. Which takes us to Unit 2, which is really our first content unit. So here we have a pretty typical setup. Some really basic course objectives, thinking about like why are we doing this stuff. My contact info easily available in case you're running into problems or notice an error or something in the class that you want to alert me to. Our first reading assignments, note that I've linked them here to our ebook, but again, it's to a particular edition of the ebook. So if the links don't go to the right place for you, whatever version of our textbook you've got, just look the story up in the index. You can usually look it up by title, which is easier. Even by author will often work. So if the links don't work, don't panic. You might just have a slightly different version of the book. Just find the stuff in your whatever edition you've got. If you're not finding it, then you do have a bit more of a problem, and you can reach out to me to see what's going on, or honestly just like find the material in a way that you want to find it. There's nothing really mandated by me that this version of the story is going to somehow be different than like the 12th edition. It's obviously the same story, like published in multiple places. There's a couple of quizzes to do, just machine gradable, really low stakes kind of things here. These for me are not super important. They're, like 10 points out of the 1,000 for our class. To me, they're useful just as almost like reading guides. So you can have the text open in front of you as you're going through the quizzes. You don't like memorize the stories we're reading or memorize material, that kind of thing. It's really more about maybe there's a question here that points you to a detail or a moment in a story that you hadn't maybe noticed before, or you'd noticed it but hadn't realized the significance of it. So again, the quizzes are not about like memorizing short stories. That would be crazy for us. They're really more like reading guides and kind of making sure that people are staying on track with the readings, but again, fairly low point value. So now we get into the more, I think, useful stuff for the class, a really broad overview of the elements of the short story or short fiction, which is kind of the piece of our Intro to Lit class that we're in right now. And so you can actually grab this handout if you wanted it for whatever reason, but you can also just use it embedded here in Blackboard. It's not an assignment here, it's just a set of terms to be aware of. Again, most of these terms you're probably familiar with. Maybe you don't know them exactly like a dictionary definition, but you've probably run into many of them before. And it's really less important that you have some like abstract definition of them. It's really more like a vocabulary that we can use to now think about and talk about the actual readings that we're doing for the class. So I don't really care if you could define major character as if we were all going to agree on like one exact definition. And that's like different than let's say a biology class where there's a particular part of the cell or whatever that has that name, and you kind of have to know that definition. There's no like application beyond that. A little different for us. We're really more concerned in the application. So for example, if we talked about like protagonist and antagonist, here we would make sure that we understand that these are not like the good guy and the bad guy. Oftentimes we can have a story where the protagonist, which we would call the main or the major character, the one around whom the action seems to revolve, even if they themselves are somewhat like a passive character. It doesn't need to be the good guy or just good or even just bad. The most complex characters are usually a combination of those things, and they have good tendencies and impulses, but also either bad ones or like unintentionally bad ones. Think about when you read a story like Joyce Carol Oates' Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? We could probably all identify the main or major character as the young girl in that story. But she's clearly not just a good guy, and she's clearly not just a bad guy either. But she's complex, right? She has different sort of motivations and tendencies. She makes different choices. So again, it's less important that you define that term, like just in the abstract. It's way more important that you apply it and think about it as you're reading these stories. And again, thinking about like what makes a really good response or reply as we get into that part of the course. It's using the terminology. So again, this is like attending class. This is what you would learn. This is what you would have access to. Can you now put this class material into practice as you're doing the things that are assessed, almost like the tests, quote unquote. Not literally these quizzes, but discussion board replies, assignments that we're doing that we'll get to. So again, it's really all about the application. So you are more than welcome to like Google any of these that you're not really sure about. I'll just make a couple of comments about some of the major ones or things that I think are interesting. Again, major, minor. This Act 1 is again a little bit potentially misleading. So the major character is the one who is that central, almost like gravitational center of the story. They're the one around whom everything revolves or depends upon. So sometimes you could in fact have a sort of passive character, but it's usually even their limited action, like going to the diner, for example, as you'll read about in the Oat story again. So that would be an action. It's not some grandiose thing, but it's an action that then triggers what we might call reactions, or like reactions to that sort of gravitational center for what we might call minor characters. And the other thing to think about, and this is what's either really frustrating or really cool about study in this area, is that we could have different interpretations about who is a major versus a minor character in this story. Is the main antagonist, is that a minor character kind of reacting to the major character? Or would you say that he in fact is a major character as well? And we don't need to come to any like definitive this is right, this is wrong kind of a thing, as long as your interpretations are grounded in evidence from the text that you can point to. So sometimes we get caught in that trap of like, oh, we can all just have our different interpretations and that's what's so cool. It is cool, but it's not really true that we can all just think whatever we want about any story. Like I could say, oh, well, it's just my opinion that all the characters in both of the stories are aliens, right? They're from Mars. Okay, no, they're not, right? There would be no evidence in the text that I could point to that would support that argument. So yes, there's flexibility. We could disagree about what character constitutes a minor character in one of the stories, for example, but we can't just all have our own completely wild opinion, because those aren't always going to be grounded in evidence from the text. So it's not a completely wide open, anything goes type of situation. Narration, important to pay attention to. First person, that I voice. Second person, very rare. You see the you voice. Think of like a choose your own adventure. You turn left, you turn right, whatever. And then third person, also very common. That's where we have almost like a camera looking at the action. He did this, she did that, they did this, they went there. The interesting thing to notice is that if it's third person, does that narrator have full knowledge of everything that happens and what everyone's thinking, so they're completely omniscient? Or is it more limited? Do they just sort of know more maybe about a main character than a minor character? And it's often that limitedness that leads us to be really wary of something like an antagonist, because we don't know, are they really bad? Are they just kind of creepy? What are their intentions? What's going on there? So often, again, we see these things working together, and it's the way in which authors apply these concepts or ideas that's really interesting. Keep an eye out, too, for the ways in which narration, especially that third person, where we would have the narrator, not technically a character in the story, but do they tend to side with a particular character's viewpoint of the world? So it's not the character speaking in the I voice, but it's almost like the narrator would sort of like agree with the way that that major character sees the world. Setting, right? where the story takes place. We can have it as literal, so we have a story or like a city named or a place named specifically, London, for example. Or it could be implied, some that they visit Big Ben or Parliament or some iconic landmark, or maybe it's a certain style of dress or behavior or like a newspaper somebody reads. It implies a particular space that the characters are working in. So it doesn't always have to be just a named thing. And the big thing to watch out for is how use of setting, details of setting, are used to communicate or develop elements of character, but also theme in the story. So setting isn't really just where a story takes place. It's the details we get about where a story is taking place as it relates to how that author is trying to communicate theme to us. So always be connecting setting to some larger, impulse in the story or thing that's going on. Conflict, you probably run into these before. Man or, human person versus man, kind of that individual struggle. Man versus some larger social force, whether it's natural, social, cultural. The person versus himself, some internal struggle. And what you'll notice is that most stories are actually a combination of all of these. So again, our point isn't to define them as individual things, and there we've done our job. It's really to apply those concepts to the stories and figure out how those stories are using each of these various types of conflict to develop tension. I'm going to jump to theme here. Again, the idea of the story, its symbolic importance, the things that you can infer that are going on. And again, it's important to notice that writers, good writers, published ones that we'll be reading, they rarely write from just an idea, or it's not really an argument they're trying to make about some larger idea. Or if it is, it's always grounded in specifics. It's not just some ethereal, unnamed characters in some unnamed space, basically just philosophizing some, concept or idea. It's always literalized in like real people doing real things, even in science fiction. The setting might be space or the 29th century or whatever, but they're still identifiably like real characters having real dialogue. It's funny, actually, if you think about it. We could watch a show, like a sci-fi show. I'll just use Star Trek as a really generic example. And so that's set like way in the future. They're doing all these futuristic things. We have this faster than light warp travel, alien cultures that people have discovered, whatever, all that stuff. So we can suspend our disbelief and say, okay, I'll buy into the universe of the world of that story. But if two characters have what seems like an inauthentic dialogue with each other, we can be watching this completely unreal, show and say something like, oh, I don't believe that would happen. Like, we can believe all the other stuff, but if something strikes us as just inauthentic about the interaction of the characters, it's still alarm bells will go off. So it's sort of a weird mix of, we can buy into all of the other stuff, but there still has to be a degree of humanity involved, even if they're not necessarily human characters that are at work. Okay, I gotta speed this up here. So the assignment itself is having you go back to your portfolio, build a new page, call it Unit 2 Mapping Short Stories, which is what we're going to do. Some walkthrough about how to build new pages, adding to your site here. And the reason I skipped, this part here is that that's really the focus of the assignment. So it's doubled up down here. So what you're going to do is take what's called this Freytag's pyramid. Freytag was a early 20th century kind of like writer, philosopher, theoretician, if you want, about narrative and storytelling and the long history of that going way back, even pre-Greek kind of a thing. But he's most famous for developing this basic narrative structure where we have a piece of exposition, and it was all based on the 5-act play, which is why there's these 5 parts. Exposition, so that sort of scene setting, we're just getting to know where we are, who the characters are. There's nothing really happening yet. We have that sense of rising action. Things are getting a little more tense. Things are going on. We have this climactic moment of conflict in the story. The sense of falling action, right? Sort of the results of this, and then life continues in the denouement. So we won't get too much into the backstory, the history of this, where it comes from, even what the various pieces mean. You could look those up further if you wanted to. But the point here is that the pyramid itself is nice and symmetrical. There's exactly as much denouement as there is exposition. There's as much rising action as falling action. If we imagined a 10-page short story, right, the conflict would happen right at the middle of like page 5 here, right in the nice symmetrical middle, so it makes a nice symmetrical triangle. No story actually works that way. And so that's what I want you to do, is to actually map the short stories that we're reading for this week. That means you have to make decisions about how much, if any, exposition do you feel like there is? How much rising action, and what are some of the moments of that rising action? What do you feel like the one kind of pinpointed climactic moment is? Is there falling action? Is there any, like, and then the next day or next year they all were different, you know? Very few stories are that obvious, but sometimes there's a kind of like follow-up, right? Is that even existing in the stories that we're reading for this week? And of course, once you determine like there's a whole bunch of rising action, the whole shape of the pyramid is going to shift way, so the apex here is going to shift way to the right, because it takes longer than just say half the story to get to that moment. And then what you might find is that a lot of stories, that falling action, it really plummets, straight down, because we're almost left hanging like, what is the implication of this? We're kind of left almost like wondering about that. So I would suggest even doing this by hand if you wanted to. It makes it a little bit easier to draw the thing. You want to label some moments in the story, so you're actually labeling moments on the pyramid itself. And then, of course, when you load this into your portfolio page, you want to explain, like, why did you draw it the way that you did? What led you to this particular shape? And so, again, what matters is not the concept that this guy put forward. It's the application of that concept to the short stories that we're actually reading. Okay? So, again, you'll be loading that picture into your portfolio, ample quotations, right, showing kind of moments on the pyramid, defending why you made your choices. So again, like telling the explanation of why you did it the way that you did it. Publish your portfolio, your updated page here, your new page. Make sure you post your URL here to the discussion board, the Unit 2 short fiction structure. And then, as usual, we have a reply component. And like I said before, just to wrap this up, there's nothing to say that you're going to have to wait until Tuesday to finish this work. If other people are posting early enough, you can jump in and do replies. And I don't want you jumping too far ahead in the course, but it's not like you have to wait until the afternoon of these particular days to do the actual work or to post the actual work. So keep your eye on the discussion board to see if you can get a little bit ahead of the game. You might even find that as you're doing this today, as I'm recording this at least, you might be jumping into this, so there's a little bit of crossover going on. Okay, kind of a longer announcement. Sorry, they just go long that way. As usual, if you have any questions, concerns, be in touch with me, and I will check in with everybody pretty soon.